Hello. So first I've been asked to have you silence your cell phones, and then we can start. So I am Eric Dodds. I am the game director on Hearthstone, and I'm going to talk a little bit about 10 things that, while we were developing Hearthstone, we found to be very, very useful sort of as high-level design things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of the things we did and also sort of why those things are important. And so here are the things that I'm going to be talking about. As you'll see, there's a whole bunch of things crossing a whole bunch of different ideas, and they're all pretty big topics, so I'm not going to be deep diving into any of the specifics. It's going to be more just talking about a couple of examples, how they related to Hearthstone and sort of the ideas behind them. So the first thing that worked out very, very, very well for Hearthstone is that we were able to iterate fast. And that's certainly something that you will hear over and over if you go to GDC talks. It's not like rocket science or anything to iterate fast. And certainly on Hearthstone we found that we had tons and tons of bad ideas that we needed to try and then not do. And so that quick iteration let us not do all of those ideas. And I guess the interesting thing is perhaps how we did the quick iteration. So to start, we had a lot of pure design time. And what I mean by that is me and Ben Brode, the other designer on the project, spent a lot of time before anything else really happened trying to figure out what the design of the game was. And I would love to say that that was planned, but accurately what I can say is that instead all of our engineers were moved to another project for a while to help out with that project. And so we got a lot of inadvertent pure design time. And for us, it was very, very important for a couple of reasons. The first reason why this design time was important was, of course, because our engineers were not asking us questions and bothering us asking those questions so we could focus on design. But actually, one of the big reasons it was important is because if we had engineers to ask us those questions, we would have answered their questions and we wouldn't have had enough information to actually know what we were going to do in the final design. And so we would have told them things that later on would have kind of hosed us, because we would have later on said, okay, here's our design now, and they would have gone, a year ago when you told us that you wanted it to work like this, well, we implemented it like this, and then it would have made it much more difficult or impossible to do the actual design that we sort of wanted to follow through with. And in this pure design time, since of course we had a couple of designers and we had our lead artist as well, but no engineers, we spent a lot of that time doing paper design. And it works, of course, very well for our game, because our game is based and comes from the physical collectible card game genre. That's its basis. But I actually think that there's a lot of games that could end up doing more paper design time than they otherwise do. And certainly I can say, as far as game development goes, one reason that it was super useful for us to do this is because, strictly from an expense point of view, I mean, having two designers working on stuff doing paper design is a cheaper thing to do than having a full team rolling. I can talk a little bit about this specific design. So when we were working on the game, we were trying to solve a whole bunch of different design problems. And this specific card or idea was trying to solve the problem of the heroes feeling really powerful. Because when we were working on Hearthstone, one of the ideas we had is we wanted heroes to not just be a punching bag, but to be this powerful character that actually interacts with the environment and isn't just something that gets beat up. And the issue we had with that, or sort of the reason we went in this direction, is we decided, hey, maybe we can make a really powerful hero who doesn't show up until later in the game. So there's a fortress that you have to smash your way through before the hero leaps out. And then once the hero leaps out, he can actually be powerful. And we actually had a whole system where you spent points buying super cool weapons and armor and stuff for him. But there ended up being a number of problems with this model, not the least of which being that you generally didn't destroy the enemy's fortress. You just built up a huge army, waited till you had overwhelming force, and then crushed their fortress and hero at the same time. But it was very, very valuable for us to try things like this, discover they were terrible, and move on just in a paper format. Another thing that worked out very, very well for us is we made a flash prototype of the game. This is a picture of the game sort of in the middle of our flash prototype ideas, not very early, but not towards the end. And what worked out well for this is that we got to try a whole bunch of the ideas in the flash prototype, and our final flash prototype mechanically actually looks almost identical to how the game looks today as far as mechanics. I mean, it doesn't have the pretty 3D world and a lot of the cool effects and all that kind of stuff, and some of the cards are certainly changed. But the game field itself and the basic interactions and mechanics and UI were all ready and done. And what that meant was when we finished with this flash prototype and we were ready to start building the real game, we pointed to the flash prototype and told our engineers, hey, we're just going to sit around for a few months. Why don't you just make that thing that's this game right here? And it let the engineers make the back end of the game exactly how it was going to end up being design-wise, so we didn't have to later on make changes and get in trouble because there were engineering problems behind the scenes. So it was a huge advantage for us to build this flash prototype. And of course, it also meant that we got to very quickly try a whole bunch of ideas, put them into the flash prototype, not worried that it was junking up the code because we knew we were going to throw it away in the long run. So another very important thing for us in Hearthstone was sharing the vision with our team. Certainly, everybody on our team is going to be participating in making the game, and if you've ever been on a game where everybody on the team is not making the same game, it doesn't go so well. And yeah, there's a lot of ways of communicating what the game is all about. You can communicate it via, just talking a lot about it, or showing some example games, or sharing design documents, which normally make people fall asleep. But what we did is we had a set of 6 stakes in the ground, and these were the basic ideas that we used to communicate both to ourselves and to new people who were joining the team, and pretty much all of the people who were involved and around the game, what the game was all about. And so that at a high level made sure that everybody who was making the game was making the same game and had these same high level ideas. Yeah, these are actually 2 of the 6 stakes in the ground, and I'll certainly be talking about some more of them later. But these stakes were just critical for communicating to the rest of the team what the game was. And the reason why that ended up being so important, or I think it's important really in all games, is that certainly on the Hearthstone team, everybody on the team is a designer, and I think this is really just true across all of game development, that all of your engineers and artists and pretty much everybody involved in the game is making design decisions, large and small. And there's a couple of ways you can go about sort of designing the game, and the way we decided to go about it is that on the design side, we sort of said, here's the big way we want this idea to work. Here's sort of the big picture idea behind whatever the system is that our engineers or artists or whatever we're putting in. And then the engineer or artist has both the knowledge, because they understand sort of the big vision, and also the on-the-ground knowledge to make the right implementation choices there, because there's often going to be a lot of small details that the person who's actually doing the implementation, the engineer or artist or whatnot, is going to notice that's going to be hard to notice up front. You, of course, could handle this as a designer by putting out a design document that details every little detail, but I've had bad experience with that in the past because design documents end up being outdated about 2 seconds usually after you send them out, and you can't really cover all the details. So sort of along the lines of this, one of the things that was very important for us, and I certainly recommend, is making sure that everybody on your team has what I think of as designer brain. And when looking at somebody to be on our team, I'm much more excited about an engineer who is a good engineer, who has designer brain and sort of can think like a designer, is engaged in the game, rather than an amazing engineer who's not really into the game you're making. They're not really interested in playing it. Don't have strong designer brain. So it made a world of difference for us on Hearthstone that sort of everybody on the team was able to make those design decisions, and it let us move forward together sort of as a whole. So simplifying Hearthstone is probably at a high level our biggest goal from the very beginning. I mean, our thought about Hearthstone as a whole was we wanted to make a game that took what's cool about collectible card games and made them accessible to a lot more people, because collectible card games in general are pretty complicated beasts that are pretty intimidating to get into. And so we wanted to make sure that we made a game that everybody could sort of understand and start playing immediately. And one of the things that meant was we started questioning the basics of what it meant to make a collectible card game, or for something to be a collectible card game. So for instance, there's a lot of collectible card games that have a lot of specific different turns, and you have to understand this phase and this phase and this phase and what can be done in each of those phases. And we decided, okay, we're going to rip all of that out. The only phase, there's only one phase, the time you get to do stuff, your turn. And during that turn, you actually can just do whatever the heck you want to do in any order. And one of the ways that turned out very well is because it actually adds some tactical depth. And one of our general rules when we're looking at simplifying a system is, can we simplify that system without removing sort of depth of play? And in fact, in this case, as we removed sort of the turn order, in a lot of ways it added depth of play. Another basic thing that we sort of thought about and challenged when working on Hearthstone was the traditional collectible card game resource model, which traditionally has your resources being cards that are drawn, that are part of your collection, just like your creatures and spells, and that you build your deck out of them. And for a whole bunch of different reasons, we felt like it was pretty important for us to simplify the game in that area and to make it so that the resources were in fact a thing that you got automatically every turn, rather than a thing that was a card in your hand. And there's a bunch of different reasons for this. Certainly one of them is, as a new player of a collectible card game, and I actually can even say for myself, who is a very experienced player of collectible card games, whenever I look at a collectible card game and go, what percentage of mana or resources or whatever I should put in the deck, I generally go online and look up something, because it's just very complicated to figure out how you should build a deck. And also, putting resources in your deck is not nearly as exciting as minions and spells. So if I'm putting together an awesome deck, I want to go, I'm going to put fireballs and giants and dragons, and resources is just, it was not as exciting. And lastly, it actually helped speed play, which was really important to us for Hearthstone, to make sure that the game played pretty fast. And normally in a collectible card game, I have two choices. At the start of my turn, I go, am I going to play a resource, or which resource am I going to play? And then I choose to do the cool thing, which is playing my spell, playing my minion, that sort of thing. And so this speeded that up as well. Another thing, this is sort of a geeky thing that makes me happy, but it's also a good example as well, is that we were able to effectively remove the idea of exhaustion in a lot of ways. And to me, why this is cool is, as we were simplifying the game, we made a lot of specific, smaller choices to simplify things that let us do something on a larger scale that felt simpler. And the smaller things that we did as we were working on Hearthstone is, when we were working on the game, we were talking about, well, do we want minions in play to be able to have an ability that you can activate? A lot of collectible card games let you use either attack with your minion or use it to do something else. And from a UI point of view, we looked at it and we went, we really like it that I can single click on a minion and it's always going to mean attack. We don't have to have a pop-up menu. We don't have to have left click, right click. It's a very simple thing. So we decided for the shipping of Hearthstone, we're not going to have any abilities on minions that are triggered by you activating them. You just attack with your minions. Then a separate thing that we did was, as we were looking at defenses and how creatures defend themselves, traditionally, if I have a guy who can stop enemy attackers, you would tap or exhaust, or whatever the term is, depending on the game, to block an enemy attacker. And at first we were thinking that was the right way to go. We didn't really like the fact that it was a response on the enemy's turn. And then I think it was a long time ago, but I think it was actually a bug where the taunt actually stayed up permanently. And we played it for a little bit like that, and we liked it, and we thought, hey, this is great. Let's get rid of a defensive creature having to, taunt or exhaust or tap or exhaust or whatever to stop an attack. And once we got rid of those two things, we realized that this concept of tapping or exhaustion normally applies to a bunch of different things, but for us at this point, all it really applies to is whether the creature has attacked or not. So what that meant was when we were doing our tutorial, we could say, hey, if the creature can attack, it has a green glow around it. If it can't, it doesn't. We're not explaining anything more to you. In fact, we only barely explain that. And so this whole concept sort of goes away, and you can understand the game much more quickly early on. Summoning sickness is something that is also traditionally in collectible card games, and it's a mechanic where a creature, when it first comes into play, cannot attack that turn. And we didn't like this very much either because it had the complexity of a creature could either not be able to attack because it already attacked, or a creature could not be able to attack because it had just come into play. And so, and I don't, again, remember if this was when we were doing the Flash prototype or doing it with physical cards, but we decided, hey, let's try to remove this and see what happens. And we removed it, and it was really, really bad. And really what happened was we were trying to simplify something, and we lost so much depth that we went, okay, we don't really love having two different things that are indicated sort of in the same way, but it doesn't matter. We have to have summoning sickness in there. It just makes for a much worse game to not have summoning sickness. So this is an example of something where we tried to simplify. The depth was just not there after we simplified, so we just decided we're going to undo it and do it the old-fashioned way. And so this is one of the things that I have discovered after many years of working on WoW and Hearthstone, which is you never stop adding stuff to your game. And so when we're talking about the game, we're going, okay, this is sort of the right level of simplicity that we want. And then over time, we start adding additional things to the game here and there for various reasons, and often it's like, oh, a little thing here and a little thing there, and very quickly you look at your beautiful, simple UI or interface or whatever it is and realize that it's not quite so simple or beautiful anymore. And that's not even to talk about what we're looking at on Hearthstone now, is to be adding additional features going forward and having this struggle between a very simple, accessible UI with all of the cool features we want to put in. So really a big example of this is our victory screen. When we were working on the game, we were like, hey, we want to have this awesome victory screen. We're going to make it look super cool. And we did that, and we had the big victory or defeat happen at the end of the game. And then a while later, we went, you know what? We probably have to have quests that award you for doing various things. So okay, the end of the game is victory or defeat, and then a quest screen pops up, because that we felt like was the best way to, or the best place to indicate that. And then we went, well, sometimes there's two quests, so it's a victory or defeat screen, and then a quest screen, and then another quest screen. And then we decided that we needed to make some changes to ranked play to add a lot more clarity there. And so then the victory defeat screen was the victory defeat screen, and a quest screen, and maybe another quest screen, and maybe the indicator that you went up or down rank. And then suddenly our beautiful, simple, end of game screen was much more complicated than I would have liked. So that's certainly an area that, if I could travel back in time, I would have gone back and seen what we could have done to make it more simpler or more integrated or something like that. But it's an example where you just never stop adding stuff, or certainly we don't. So the next big point is sort of a super obvious one, keep it deep. And it's sort of course, at odds with the simplify idea. But again, really what it meant was that whenever we were simplifying the game, we were focusing on removing complexity rather than removing depth. And if we ever remove complexity and also remove depth, we thought about that change, like the summoning sickness one. Or if we ever were in a case where we felt like we really had to simplify the game and we were going to lose some depth, we then thought about what's an idea that we can put back into the game to make sure that we still have all of that depth there, that's not as complex as the previous idea. So probably the biggest thing that we did in Hearthstone to sort of address that directly was hero powers. And In some other collectible card games, there's a variety of things that you can do with your mana on the board, and you can play cards out of your hand and other things, so there's a lot of combinatorics. And as we changed the game, we realized that we didn't have as many combinatorics as far as the possible ways you could play your sets of cards. So for instance, without hero powers and without anything else, if I have 3 mana and I have a card that costs 3 and a card that costs 1, I'm pretty much just going to play the card that costs 3. So what we did was add hero powers, which is a thing that you can do every turn that costs 2 mana that is not as powerful as a card, but is still a very useful thing to do, and also very class specific. So if I have 3 mana and I have a hero power, I can either use the 3 mana card or use my 1 mana card and use my hero power, or maybe I just use my hero power, and this is only in the simple case. But it's really an example of us wanting to make sure that there were a lot of tactical depth and a lot of tactical choices as you were playing the game, and we put hero powers in to do that, as well as a few other things, but that was the primary reason. This is a slide that will jump back a little bit to the simplicity slide. When we are making a card, we have sort of a general rule, which is if someone new reads that card for the first time and they do not understand it immediately, they have to stop and parse it, then that card is probably too complicated, and either we go back and we spend a lot of time wordsmithing that card to make sure that that effect is something that you can instantly understand, or in a lot of cases we actually went through and we just junked that card or that idea or changed it in some way to make it easily understood. And actually, as a quick aside, parse is a word that I use a lot when we're talking about the team, and for me that means, does the player who's reading whatever the text is have to actually stop and figure out what it meant? So if I'm reading along and I go, what was that word? Oh yeah, that word means this other thing. Okay, I had to stop, and it's a bit of a jarring experience, and we really want a flow state. So you're reading the card and you don't even know that you've stopped to read it, you just understand what it does. And going back to the keep it deep idea, for our game where we focus on the depth is focusing on combinations of cards making for interesting interactions. So for instance, the first card here is Whirlwind. It does 1 damage to all minions. There's some interest in that card in and of itself, but when you add a second card to that, that's another pretty straightforward card, a card that whenever it takes damage, you draw a card, it becomes a lot more interesting, because you might play your Acolyte of Pain out and then Whirlwind, and suddenly a negative thing turns into a positive. And throw the Berserker on top of that gets stronger every time anything takes damage, and then suddenly you have a lot of interesting depth there. But we didn't get that depth through just making a lot of text or a card you have to really parse. Okay, so the fifth thing is immediate fun, and this was actually one of our stakes in the ground, immediate fun for new players. And one of the conundrums here is that learning is normally fun, and as a new player, you'd think, hey, I'm learning a game, all these things I'm learning, it's normally a fun thing, except that when you don't know enough to see where the fun is, to see where the depth is, it's often not immediately fun. And so we talked a lot and worried a lot about the experience of players having 10 seconds into the game and 30 seconds into the game, and how quickly can a player really understand this game, and how quickly are they having fun. So one of the things that we did was we made sure that we kept text short, and it led to some pretty funny conversations, because we'd talk about some piece of our introductory text where we're teaching you the game, and we'd go, wow, that text has 6 words in it. That's kind of a lot. Is there any way we can cut that down? And those were serious conversations we had. And then we used context in combination with that text, so lots of bouncing arrows, sort of a green highlight around the thing that you should be interacting with, to very quickly get you playing the game rather than reading about how to play the game. And that was super important to us. Another thing that was pretty important, and I think it's pretty straightforward, but that as long as the player has learned enough to actually start playing the real game, we didn't want to teach them anything else. So sort of our goal with our introductory experience was to teach the player enough so they felt like, hey, I know how to play this game, I'm going to go jump into this game, rather than teaching them everything that they needed to know to play the game sort of in the long run. And this is partially because learning stuff is actually really fun, but it's also partially because we just wanted to get you through this experience and through the sort of the talking experience and to the main experience very quickly and very painlessly. So there was very often during development, people around the company would say, hey, you don't teach the player about freeze or secrets or all kinds of things that we deliberately didn't teach the player about because we felt like we teach the player about this. You know what, they're going to learn this later once they're actually jumped in and having a good time with the game and playing the game, and we just don't need to explain this to you. You will figure it out and you'll have a good time figuring it out. But really, I can say we actually just listened to George Fan. He's the designer of Plants vs. Zombies, and he has said a whole lot more than I will say today about how to make an awesome introductory experience. And he gave a talk here a couple of years ago. If you do a search for George Fan, GDC 2012, you'll find it. And internally, we really just said, is this experience up to the sort of Plants vs. Zombies introductory experiences? That's sort of the gold standard we used. And if you're working on an introductory experience, I cannot recommend enough listening to George, because he's just a smart dude, especially about introducing players to games. So this is a point that has a lot more to do probably with our games than a lot of games you're working on, and that is embracing the medium. And to us, what that means is we're coming from this physical CCG space, and we're going to a digital space, and our goal was to make the best digital collectible card game we could. So we didn't want to end up thinking about or getting stuck with any of the things that work great in a physical space and do not work as well in a digital space. And there were a number of those. Probably the biggest thing that we implemented along those lines were secrets. And what that is in response to is in, I would say, an awful lot of physical collectible card game, there's a concept called responses, where I play a card on my turn, and my enemy out of turn can play a card in response to that, and I can play a card in response to that, and so on. And this works great in physical collectible card games because sort of the nature of the interaction that you're having with the other player. I mean, you're basically having a conversation with the person who's sitting across from you, and the nature of just basic conversation has a lot of shifting backwards and forwards in time and interrupting, and it's sort of built for that. And so with a response in a physical collectible card game, I can go, I'm going to play a giant, and now I'm going to play a drat, and then go, wait, no, go back to that other thing. I'm going to counterspell it or lightning bolt it or whatever the heck you're going to do. And it works great in that space. In a digital space, because you don't have that immediate back and forth, that conversation, it's either one person's turn or the other, it causes a lot of problems. And so because we were designing specifically for the digital space, we put secrets in the game. And this is because we wanted to make sure we kept the depth of me doing something on my turn and not knowing that I'm going to get to do all the cool stuff, that there might be a surprise waiting for me on my opponent's side. And a secret is a card that you put into play that is triggered by a set of circumstances, and when it's triggered, it does a specific thing, but your opponent doesn't know what those circumstances are. So they can try to play around it, but in a lot of ways it's a lot like trying to play around a response. You know, if you are seeing your opponent in Magic has 2 blue mana open, you're definitely assuming certain things, and secrets are a lot the same way. So that's what we did to make it a digital game and emphasize that. Another thing we did was put digital cards in, cards that you can really only make in the digital space. Some of those cards we just put in because we wanted to mess around with the space and see what the possibilities were, like Nozdormu, which is a card that changes the turn timer to 15 seconds. So that's a card that wouldn't work at all in a physical space, but in a digital space it's kind of fun, it's kind of interesting, and as we try cards like that, we're going to find some that are super exciting. For me, one of the more exciting things, though, was where we got to solve problems by being in a digital space that you can't really solve in a physical space. So the Thought Steal card here was originally, long ago, a card that when you played it, you actually took 2 cards out of your opponent's deck rather than copying them. And when you take 2 cards out of your opponent's deck, there was a lot of emotional negativity to that, especially from our high-level players who felt like you're taking 2 of the cards that are the cards that cement my deck together, my endgame cards, the cards that solve problems. And it was very emotionally negative, and we wanted to solve that problem. And so what we did was we thought about it and went, hey, we're a digital game, let's just make it copy cards out of their hand. It still gives you the feel of beating up the opponent with their cards, but we lose that emotional negativity of actually stealing the cards from the opponent. So another thing that was important to us, and it's kind of funny to be saying this because on one hand I'm saying we wanted to look at what we wanted to be changing, and on the other hand I'm saying don't change too much. And what I mean really by don't change too much is make sure that all of the things that players are sort of expecting when they come to your game, that you are providing for them, because those are things that you don't have to explain to the player. And anything that you don't have to explain to the player is just a godsend. So for a first-person shooter, it would be something like, okay, WASD are going to be my control keys, because I don't have to explain that to the player, and they'll get angry if you don't have that. But there's some areas that are a little bit interesting in the decisions we made in Hearthstone and why we made them. So for instance, early on we were talking about, hey, this is a digital game. One of our stakes in the ground was embrace the digital nature of the game, and we went, does it have to be a card? Could it be a rune? How about a potion vial that pours the guy out on the ground? Of course, there was lots of talk about, Star Wars chess. Say it'll be little miniature monsters fighting it out there. And so this is actual concept art for the game where we were trying to figure out what the heck is our collectible going to be, because it could be anything. It doesn't have to be a card. And after talking about it a lot, we went, you know what, it's crazy for us to not make it a card, because as a card, anyone who's ever played cards, whether it's, a collectible card game or Hearts or Spades or any card game, knows that you can shuffle cards, that you can draw a hand of cards, that you can play cards, they can be discarded. There's a whole bunch of things that you understand about cards, and a large group of people understand about cards that we don't have to explain. And so there's no way we're giving that up, because it's so important to have that sense of familiarity and sort of know what the game's going to be. Also, we spent a lot of time talking about the words that we used for everything, because it's so important to use words people know. And it sort of seems obvious that the attack value of a minion should be attack, and the health value of a minion should be health. But one of the reasons that I point that out is because there's sometimes an idea of, hey, our game is all about this thing, so instead of health, let's call our defensive trait morale. And what that means is anytime a player sees morale, first off, they have to learn what the heck morale is, and second off, they have to end up parsing your game more, because when something says, hey, gives a minion +3 health, you don't have to parse it at all. You instantly know, I know what that thing does, assuming I know which bubble is attack and which bubble is health. Whereas if it says give +3 morale, I not only have to know what morale is, I then have to figure it out. And so just using terms people know is super important. We spent tons of time even talking about what should we call the offensive trait. Okay, let's call it charge, because when we were talking through it at Blizzard, most people felt like that would be the trait that lets you attack right away. What's the defensive trait? It's taunt, et cetera, et cetera. Tons of time spent just figuring out sort of the names for things. And even the names of your spells and minions and cards was pretty important. So, for instance, early on, we are trying to explain to the player what's the difference between a minion and what's the difference between a spell. And it's not, especially to someone who's new to collectible card games, it's not a super obvious thing. But if we call one of our early spells Fireball, you actually, in your head, already know what a Fireball does. You know, oh, it's going to deal some damage and go away. So while we're teaching you about spells, at the same time, you have a thing that you know is a spell from your outside experience, which you can go, okay, I know how this is going to work. And we even actually get additional bonuses here in that You probably think of Fireball as a spell from the outside experience. Hey, that's an attack spell that probably does a fair amount of damage, and so suddenly you know, hey, 6 damage is probably a reasonably fair amount of damage. So we're teaching you a bunch of stuff just by the names of things based on outside experience, and that stuff is super valuable too in sort of keeping things the same for players and giving them what they expect. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, supporting player stories. And what a player story is specifically is the thing that your buddy is going to tell you that night about their experience in the game the day before. And it's usually not about the narrative that they've read in the story. It's usually, hey, I tried to play last night and the servers were down, or hey, I tried to play last night and I got crushed a couple of times, or I used this crazy combo and it was awesome. And those are the sorts of things that actual player stories are, and it's important for us to embrace player stories, and especially as a game that's trying to keep sort of our scope down and be very focused, we really wanted to focus on the player story and not really worry at all about like the narrative story. So this is story time, where I get to tell a story about World of Warcraft. This is a dungeon called Sunken Temple from World of Warcraft, and this dungeon has a whole bunch of story to it, and there's a green dragon and some trolls trying to do something or other to a god, and despite the fact that I worked on World of Warcraft for 8 years, I still couldn't actually tell you what the real story is, but it's something like that. And that story was not super important to me as I was playing through World of Warcraft. The story that mattered to me was one where me and a bunch of friends went into Sunken Temple, and back in the day it was a very, very vertical dungeon, so we traveled all the way up to the top of the dungeon, and once we got to the top of the dungeon we wanted to get to the bottom of the dungeon, and you know, we could have fought our way back down, but one of my friends, she said, hey, there's this hole in the middle of the floor, why don't you just jump down, there's water down there, we'll jump down and we'll fight and we'll have a good time and we'll avoid all that horrible walking. So all of us, of course, except for her, jumped, and we realized the water's about, you know, that deep, and we all died, and we all laughed our asses off. And for me, that's the story of Sunken Temple. And while it's not a fantastic narrative story, it's a story that's mine, and it's important to me. And so I really feel like giving players those stories is super important, and arguably more important than giving them, you know, the narrative story. So one of the things that we do in Hearthstone to support this is we create cards that create player stories. And really how we end up designing those cards is we think of a card idea and go, I have no idea what that card idea is going to do. That's probably going to do something really weird and scary, and when we're making these cards we actually have a general rule, which is if the card doesn't scare us, we probably should try to make it scarier, and then we'll try to figure it out in design later, or balance later, if it's balanced or not. So this specific card, to give an example of a player story that comes from this specific card, this is a card that is a very powerful card for cost 2, but once it comes into play, all of your opponent's minions are free for a turn. And so there's a well-known streamer who, at one point on turn 1, played this card, using the coin, so they got an extra mana on turn 1. So on turn 1 they had a 4/4, which is very powerful. His opponent then proceeded to play a spell for free that took a bunch of cards out of his deck, actually the Thought Steal, and then another copy of that took some more cards out of his deck, and then a card that copied a card out of his hand, and then the card that he copied out of his hand he played, which all of these were, of course, free, which summoned a random minion from the streamer's deck, which ended up being Ragnaros, which Ragnaros immediately fired and destroyed Millhouse Mana Storm. So the game went horribly, horribly wrong, but it was an awesome, awesome story. And it's not a story that when we were creating Millhouse Mana Storm we had any clue was going to happen. Mostly we created a card that had a lot of possibilities, a lot of open-endedness, and then the players gave us back the stories with all the crazy things that are happening with it. Another thing that is important to us is randomness, and that's certainly an area where there's a lot of, I would say, contention in the community, but randomness is a pretty important element for creating player stories as well. So this is a picture of our arena mode, and how arena mode works is you are presented with 3 different heroes at random. You pick one of those heroes, and then 30 times in a row you choose one of the 3 cards that is presented to you. And we have some light controls on the rarity of some of these cards that show up, but we don't have super strong controls, and we certainly don't control the number of any specific card that comes up. So it's been known to happen in the past that you play an arena run and you get 11 copies of Frostbolt, or 6 Unleash the Hounds and 6 Starving Buzzards, or any other combination of cards, or heck 4, or well, probably not 4, probably like 3 Leroy Jenkins, but combinations of cards that are just not possible in the real game, I should say the ranked game, and that create really interesting stories. And one of the reasons we can actually do this is because our arena mode, you play until you lose 3 games or win 12 games. So no matter what the deck is, it's going to very quickly leave the environment one way or the other, and then there will be a new crazy deck that you're playing. And once you get to the high end, you're playing somebody else's crazy deck. So this randomness creates a whole lot of stories, and those stories, again, are really important to us for sort of the health of the game. And this is just saying that our game specifically chose to have no story, and we just focus on vibes. So we say, hey, we're an inn, we're a warm, cozy place, come in and play games, and what we want to do is share your stories. And again, it's not because I think narrative stories are bad. I think in a lot of games, narrative stories are great. I think they just require a ton of work. I mean, it almost has to be the primary thing you're going for if you're going for a narrative story. And since that was not our focus, we didn't go in that direction. And I've certainly seen a lot of games that they go, well, we're not really going to focus on narrative story, but we want to have one anyway. And very often I see that getting in the way because that story is told with, just pop-up dialogues with text in them or something like that that is not telling a super compelling story. So mostly I'm saying, if you're going to tell a story, just focus on telling the story. But in a lot of cases, it's probably better to just stick with vibe and let the players tell the story. And certainly that's our belief with Hearthstone. This is also very near and dear to my heart, and that is that emotional design matters. And what I mean by that is it's very important to be paying attention to the emotional state of the player as they're playing the game and as they're encountering things in the game. And in a lot of cases, that's more important than sort of the mechanical design or in some cases even the high-level balance. So one thing that we've discovered is very often there's emotion in unintended places that as a game developer certainly we don't necessarily, or I often don't think about and should think about more. And so for instance, a moment of high emotion that's going to probably be higher emotion than anything else a player will encounter in your game is when they run into the server being down, or there being an error message, or a number of things like that are not things that normally we design for, but I think it's pretty important to pay attention to, sort of the emotional state. And this is actually an example of where we changed the game a little bit to make the emotion of the game better. So this is our spinner, and this comes up whenever you're doing matchmaking. And it has a bunch of funny things that it says, and it always ends up on, well, back in the day, it always ended up on a perfect opponent. And when you actually play the game after you're matched with this opponent, sometimes it is a blowout, whether it's because they got good cards or you got bad cards or they're a better player than you. There's all kinds of reasons why it could be a blowout, even if it was a pretty good match. But what that means is early on a player would see a perfect opponent, get blown out in the match, and go, I'm super pissed at Blizzard. This makes me angry because it said a perfect opponent, and this did not feel like a perfect opponent. And so we actually just changed the text to read a worthy opponent because it changed qualitatively sort of the emotional response. I mean, it's still never fun to get blown out, but it was qualitatively better just changing the wording and setting the expectation slightly differently. We also do a lot of design for emotion. This is a discard from the physical WoW trading card game, discard card, and this is a mechanic that we actually don't do any of in Hearthstone because the effect of playing discard and certain other types of mechanics on your opponent is super disheartening. It sort of makes your opponent feel powerless. And it's sort of a weird state, actually, because it's fun to play discard decks, and counterspell decks is another type of deck that we're not really supporting, or resource destruction, all of those things. It's fun to play those, but it's not fun to have those played against you. And we felt like the emotional negativity that came from having that played against you was so strong that we didn't feel like that we could really include those mechanics in our game. And it's actually, in some cases, a problem for us, because there are certain types of decks in the metagame that it would be useful if we had discard as a tool to put in players' hands to deal with sort of those types of decks. But the emotional negativity is so strong, so we're just not going to do it. We're designing for emotion and just taking those straight out. We also do a lot of balance for emotion. A significant number of our changes over the last 6 months or so have been made actually for emotional responses and emotional feedback, rather than like high-level balance thoughts. And Mind Control is one of those cards that we changed. It's a card that when you play it, you take an opponent's minion and put it onto your side, and now you own it. And the emotional response to that is very strongly negative. And we heard all these people complaining everywhere, oh my god, Mind Control is too powerful, I can't play against it, it's the strongest card in the game. And we looked at the numbers, and it was just fine. The card was not an overpowered card. The problem with the card is it felt super bad to have it played against you, so we actually increased the cost of the card significantly to make it so that it would be seen less sort of in the game as a whole, that it's more of a niche card, even though from a pure balance point of view we didn't have to make any changes to it. It was just an emotionally balanced card, or an emotionally unbalanced card, I guess, that we felt like we needed to change. Also, one thing that was pretty interesting that we talked a lot about when we were designing the game is, when do we provide the audio and visual feedback to support specific emotions? So when we were first building the game, our artists were working on the effects of attacking, and they're like, we're going to make this awesome effect when my minion crashes into the enemy hero or your minion. It's going to be super cool. And after we talked about it for a while, we realized that while the attack is a very important moment narratively, like in a movie, whatever, that is going to be the high moment of emotional, impact. In Hearthstone, by the time something's attacking, you probably actually know what it's going to be attacking. Or if you don't, you're like, he could attack this or this. Yeah, he attacked that. It's not emotionally high moment. So instead, what we did is instead of focusing our audio and visual effects there as much, we focused a lot more on summoning cards into play, because actually the high emotional moment in a game of Hearthstone is when my opponent first puts something into play, because it could be anything. It could change the game entirely, and you just have no idea. So that's the moment of tension. What are they going to play? What are they going to play? Oh my goodness, it was, Ragnaros or whatever it was. So just for us, focusing our visual attention on the emotional moments that were actually relevant to the specific game were important. And lastly, another topic that is near and dear to my heart, little victories. And the idea of little victories is that in a player versus player game, it's very important to give the player moments where they feel like they did something badass and changed the course of the game. And to sort of, and this is only referred to in a player versus player game, because in a player versus environment game, that's actually in a lot of cases what the entire game is just a series of little victories. I mean, World of Warcraft is just you doing lots of little cool things and improving your character, and it's not a big moment where you go, hooray, I beat World of Warcraft. So we focus on, so we talk about it relating to PvP. And sort of an example I have of a good and bad version of this is a bad version of little victories is I play a first-person shooter and I get killed sort of at my spawn point 5 times, and then we lose. Or even we win at that point, but in either case I feel terrible, versus a first-person shooter where I snipe a guy, and then I sneak up on a guy and kill him, and then I die a couple times, and then we still lose. I feel so much better about that. And so I would argue that actually the little victories are in a lot of ways more important than the big victory. So for Hearthstone, we think of the game as sort of like a puzzle, in that on your turn, how you should go about your turn is, at the start of your turn, go, the enemy has a bunch of minions in play, I'm in big trouble, I've got nothing out, I'm going to solve this puzzle, and by the end of your turn, you've done smart stuff, they don't have minions in play, I have minions in play, I've sort of turned it around, and have it go back and forth each turn. And in a lot of cases, that's how it plays out, is a lot of back and forth, and you get all of those little victories, so that whether you win or lose the final game, I mean, it still matters. Don't get me wrong, it's still much better to win, but it makes it so that either way, you still felt like it was a good and fun game. And this is actually one of the reasons why we have been aggressively looking at decks that are called one-turn kill decks. And this is a type of deck in Hearthstone that a player sort of just hangs out and makes the enemy not be able to do anything for a while, or removes their minions, but it doesn't really damage you. And then late game, it drops a bunch of cards on the table and kills you in one turn without sort of any warning. And those decks are super fun to play, and they are very challenging to play. I mean, it requires a lot of skill to play a really good one-turn kill deck. But how it feels for the opponent is it doesn't feel like you gave the opponent those little victories. So basically, as the opponent of a one-turn kill deck, in a lot of cases, you feel like, yeah, I put out some stuff and it was destroyed, and I put out some stuff, it was destroyed, and I'm not doing anything cool, and suddenly I lost without any ability to sort of save myself. And so as we've been looking at the balance of the game, the effects that do one-turn kills have been ones that we've been very seriously looking on and made a number of changes to. And I think that's actually it. So that is all I have to say about Hearthstone for now. Yep, thanks a lot for coming. I'm happy to talk to people if they want to talk afterwards.